Welcome to week 3, or at least the end of week 2, going into week 3, everybody. Really exciting stuff happening in our Goodreads reviews. I'm really excited to read how your views of young adult literature are shifting. Certainly we had a big shift, I think, going from just the writing style of Elizabeth Acevedo moving into Jeff Zentner, but I think that a lot of you did a really nice job of giving your thoughts about what Jeff Zentner's writing was about, what his plot, and you were really thinking like writers, it felt like at times as I was reading your reviews this week. And so that was really quite a pleasure for me. And so I appreciated the different perspectives that all of you brought. And certainly I see that shift, especially for those of you who say, well, I haven't read a lot of young adult literature. It seems like y'all are taking this on a really deep level and doing a lot of deep analysis as we are reading. So I really do appreciate that. A couple of things that I'd like to go through is, first and foremost, let's jump into some of those reviews, because there were certainly some themes that I noticed that I'd love to sort of tease out, as I did last week with Poet X, and do the same thing with the Serpent King. So this first comment comes from Bobby. Bobby says, "At first I somewhat disliked this novel's organization and often found myself wincing at the text exchanges and cliché internal dialogue. I recognize that these writing techniques are standard for YA literature, and I can understand how it would keep a young reader interested." And this notion of cliche is actually something that came up, I feel like, quite often as I was going through a lot of your comments. The concern over whether or not the representation of young adult life, I think, probably came out of the keywords, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. What's the purpose of this genre? Who is it written for, and what responsibility do these authors have towards prospective readers? But this idea of cliche, as if there is some sort of representation of young adult life that is typical, perhaps overdone. I think the notion of trope, or the concept of tropes in YA literature, is something that we are extra cautious of, recognizing that these are, again, our adults writing about young people and trying to write books that are going to appeal to young people today, even though they may be 35, 45, 55 years old, right? And so that's really tricky to think as both a writer and also to try to appeal to a certain age. And so I think that this is a comment, this notion of cliche, and also something that Bobby wrote here, which I think was interesting, was to say, well, I sort of accept it as part of this genre, that these are older adults talking to young adults, and I accept this as just something that comes as part of the YA genre. So maybe that's something we need to wrestle with a little bit as we continue to read. Another comment, this next one comes from Rebecca, and Rebecca said, "I had real issues with how Lydia was written. This character is a cool girl caricature. Glasses, alternative hair color, quirky, sarcastic, and a unique dresser. I found her to be a wholly unbelievable character. 100K social media followers, interview in the New York Times, being a guest judge on a television show. I just couldn't wrap my head around such a person living in Forestville. She was also a terrible friend to Dylan Travis. It seemed everything she did for them benefited her or her blog. She treated them as projects and not people." And I don't know if this is a commentary, Rebecca, that you made about Jeff Zentner, or if this is a commentary as, if I met Lydia in real life, it's not the type of person that I would like. Either way, it's a really wonderful observation. And I think one of the difficulties we see here, and something that I want all of you to consider as you're thinking about your keywords final paper, if you're going to write that, what's the representation of female characters, and is there some additional trouble that's to be made when we have a male author writing female characters? There's no rules that say they can't do that, and certainly that's allowed, but is this issue here a Jeff Zentner issue in the way that he's representing his female characters, or is this an issue with regard to he wrote this character to be unlikable, or this is just my my impression of Lydia. And so these are things that we need to be able to figure out. Certainly these are caricatures, tropes, cliches of the cool girl insider, like, I have better music taste than all of you. That's something that happens. It happens with females and it happens with males as well. I think the latter comment here of her being unlikable because she only does things that benefit her is something that's really quite interesting. And that jumps over to Jenna's comment here. Jenna says, my problem is that this story only offers one solution to growing up in a small rural setting. Leave. Go to college. Reinvent yourself once you are surrounded by new people. As someone who grew up in a rural setting and did not go to college for a number of years after I graduated high school, I know that this isn't the only solution. Of course, in YA literature, it is so important to show that characters can achieve their goals and overcome their hardships. I just don't think that running away from rurality is always the answer. And so Jenna, I appreciate that Jenna's also speaking as someone who has taken place-based pedagogies and understands sort of this importance of place. And so I know that this is something that she has teased out and really looked at in her research as well as in her reading. You can see. And that's a theme that I would have liked to see a few more people even wrestle with, is this representation of rurality fair? Is that a solution? Because this is a theme, again, another trope that we see quite often in rural themed books, young adult literature in particular, is that the solution is to get out of your small, one-horse, very parochial, closed-minded rural town. We gotta go, gotta leave. There's no way we can stay here. I think Jeff Zentner did a good job of helping Dill wrestle with that. Remember, there was that moment where Lydia kept making fun of these the folks who are going to be stuck in Forestville, who one day when she comes back and visits her folks, they'll be the ones serving her fries, and Dill goes to her and says, well, what if I'm the one who's going to be here serving you fries? Obviously, that's a moment of struggle there, where Dill realizes that he could be stuck in Forestville, not by choice, but just stuck. And so he ends up leaving. Is that the right decision? Would we have preferred to see Dill sort of survive and be a little bit more resilient and say, I'm going to stay home and help my mom, even though my mom sort of has things a little bit backwards with regard to values? I don't know. What do we do in these situations? So these are things where we have to be empathetic with these characters as well. And this last comment here that I'll share is from Caitlin. It says, the shelter of Dill through his friends allowed the reader to stay in a comfortable space and still be able to approach very adult themes of physical abuse, finding self-identity when it has already been decided for you, and love that comes with both hatred, disappointment, and sadness, as well as pure happiness. I found myself gathered into a looking glass that provided a mirror of my personal experiences and those of people I knew, but also provided a window through which other YA readers can learn to be there for their friends and to be there for themselves. And so just really highlighting all those themes that Caitlin mentioned, I think are really important. Self-identity, physical abuse. I think that even the themes carrying over between Poet X and the Serpent King, this notion of religion, I think, was complicated further by this notion of faith, because we still saw moments where Dill was praying to a god who it was very uncertain whether or not he believed in. And so this, in a particular church where faith is often tested with serpents, and whether or not you can hold and feel as though you'll be protected by God. His faith was really tested in really challenging ways. And so I think that's really fascinating to look at those themes as mentioned here by Caitlin. And so the next thing I want to do is jump over into the reading from this week, which was all about young adult. And again, the pairings in these first couple weeks weren't perfect, but they were meant to sort of set the tone for what we would be reading. And so that notion of identity we saw not only applied to the Poet X, but also certainly applied to the experiences of Dill and Lydia and Travis, and really owning their identities, right? And so even that first week's reading isn't going to just exist in Poet X text world, right? And so we're going to be carrying this notion of identity throughout this entire semester. The same can be said for what does it mean to be a young adult? And so young adult I wanted us to read through what Tally had to share because it defines a genre. And I thought that it paired really nicely, and a lot of you picked up on this notion of cliche and a particular genre, but also this piece about what even does what defines young adult as a genre, as a set of texts, a collection of texts by different authors, and so what is the defining factor or factors of what makes up a young adult text? And so there's a few definitions that I'd like to share and some ideas here. First and foremost, we look at this notion of age. And so YALSA, which is the Young Adult Library Services Association, they say between the ages of 12 to 18 as composing as the stage of young adulthood. And so between the ages of 12 and 18. Now, if you compare an 18-year-old to a 12-year-old, for those of you who have children, or if you just remember what it was like to be in 6th grade versus a senior in high school, that's quite a broad range. So there's a lot of times, particularly in school spaces, where we will refer to probably closer to 11 to 15 as middle grades, and that 15 then to 18 range really as young adulthood. But that's referring to the students, right? That's referring to the audience. We saw that Random House extends this definition by saying they include now this is perhaps a different term for a lot of you, the MTV demographic, which extends well into the age of 25. Now, I grew up with MTV. I'm sure most of you did not. And even if you did grow up with MTV, it probably didn't have a whole lot of music on music television, MTV. So you'll have to excuse this very old and archaic definition. But yes, we can say that as old as 25. So now, if you extend that definition, the age of Random House that they're gearing their literature toward are then between the ages of 12 and 25. And so even though that is quite a wide range of people reading perhaps the same texts, we recognize that some texts are geared more towards that 18 to 25 demographic, and there are going to be texts that are geared more towards that 12, 13, 14, 15-ish range. And so, again, the other piece we can complicate here, and I think that Tally mentions it, but I would like to highlight a little bit more. What if young adult has very little to do with the people with whom the genre is intended for, those readers? What if instead it is more about the age, or less about the age of the readers and more about just the issues that people in that age range are facing? So perhaps the characters are high school age and they are early middle school age, perhaps. What if they're dealing with themes of young adulthood? So perhaps they're dealing with things like, as we've talked about, identity, race, classism, sexuality. Those are the types of things I think that define the genre more so than, would a 12-year-old like this book? And I think those are important for us to define here pretty quickly. And so going on there, I thought that Tally did a fine job of going through and really providing a small history. I had never heard of Sarah Trimmer before or The Guardian, but that was the first instance, it sounds like, with Trimmer talking about finding books for children and young persons from the most respectable sources. And so we need to be able to honor Sarah Trimmer for that, but also perhaps she was being a bit didactic and trying to say these need to be moral texts to help provide a moral underpinning for young people. Certainly that's not the case any longer. And this quote here from Williams, this notion of realism, I think is something that we are taking up and realizing is really quite important. Realism as a description of facing up to things as they really are and not as we imagine or would like them to be. And so then building on with that, this notion of going against romance, right? What S.E. Hinton is talking about is the romantic romanticism of what it means to grow up and to be a young person. Those novels about Horse and the Girl Who Loved It, as well as Fairyland of Proms and Double Dates. Because what S.E. Hinton talks about and what other authors really started to appreciate, particularly in other texts besides The Outsiders, Cormier's The Chocolate War, for example, Rabbit Run, like all these texts from these early YA canonical texts, they liked addressing the difficulty of growing up and the difficulty of coming of age. And so that's really part of the Bildungsroman, right? Where these texts that were, in Trimmer's opinion, perhaps not written about young people, but were appropriate for. That's what I grew up with. I like The Catcher in the Rye a lot. It's one of my favorite texts, but it was not a text that was necessarily written with me in mind, right? The Outsiders is a book that was written by a young person. S.E. Hinton was quite young when she wrote it, but it was written by a young person for young people to talk about the fact that growing up is difficult. And so it's difficult here. Again, I'll remind us that we are older people reading a genre of texts that perhaps is not meant for us, and that is okay. Let's remember, too, that sometimes we need to read books for escape. And so even though this notion of realism is important and that it should portray the challenges of growing up, sometimes young people need to escape the fact that their lives are hard. So that escapism and reading fantasy and reading lives that are outside of their own, that show a different side of hope for a young life, sometimes matters a whole heck of a lot too. And that there's also this need, again, as we saw and as we listened to Grace Lynn this week, about this notion of windows and mirrors. And that texts, if we only read mirrors and we only read books that are about how difficult our lives are, we are going to continue to go down that rabbit hole. Sometimes we need books that are also windows into other people's lives as well. And that's really quite important. And so it also brings up much larger questions when we're talking about sexuality, when we're talking about race, when we're talking about other things like abuse. That's where the issues of censorship come in and what books are belonging in our classrooms. Censorship is something that will come up in our next text, which is going to be Hearts Unbroken. So just a few things about Hearts Unbroken to give you a quick book talk about this. We will be reading this book that deals with, I chose it originally because I wanted a romance novel. As I'm rereading it, I'm not sure that I'm convinced it's a full-on romance novel. I will say that the other important thing for me was that we had an Indigenous author in our summer reading text. And so reading something Indigenous with an own voices focus was really important to me. And so Cynthia Leitich Smith writes this book. She's a New York Times bestseller. And so she's writing from the perspective of a Muskogee Creek Nation American Indian. The story takes place in Kansas, but there are moments where she talks about life. The main character, Louise Wolfe, talks about life in Oklahoma and Texas, and so it's more of that center part of America here, where she is talking about what life was like and what her experiences are in high school as an American Indian. There are instances where racism, classism, as well as sexuality come into play. So there's a lot of issues and a lot of keywords that we can pull out for this in case you're looking for more keywords. You can see that there is a lot that we can pull on that are similar threads between Poet X, Serpent King, and as you're reading, you'll see a lot of those things come through with regard to what you are going to read with Hearts Unbroken. So I'm very excited for y'all to get into that. You will also be reading the keyword of race, and so you'll read that as well. Again, my suggestion is to read that beforehand and pay close attention to the types of things that you are seeing in your keywords. A few things, a few notes that I'll make about that I thought Tally did a really nice job of. First one was pulling on different authorities. Again, you saw definitions from things like YALSA and Random House. And so you can see how the authors are using different terms again, different authorities, different experts from different fields in order to first provide a definition for their keyword. They quoted specific authors, and so if you wanted to pull on a particular thread, you might look at what did Cynthia Leitich Smith say about rurality, and did Jeff Zentner have anything to say about rurality? And then you can use your quotes around rurality from those authors to create greater and finer definitions of what we might mean by the theme or representation or keyword of rurality in young adult literature. And so there's just an example right there. And then you saw just the examples, lots and lots of examples of books and sort of putting them in similar categories. Tally does a nice job of saying, Philip Pullman and J.K. Rowling, they're sort of in this area over here. S.E. Hinton and Cormier, they're over here. Sherman Alexie and Laurie Halse Anderson are sort of in this similar space. And so you can see the way they also do some categorization. So if you're thinking about doing your keywords, pay close attention to these as mentor texts, as craft, as style, as the things that you may want to do for your paper. So please make sure you're revisiting these keywords because you may want to produce something similar for yours. I hope this has been helpful. It's wonderful at least getting to speak in some ways to you. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, enjoy week 3. Happy reading with Hearts Unbroken.